It was a sunny day in the little town of Elmwood. The birds chirped outside, and the sky was clear. A gentle breeze blew through the trees. It was the kind of day when everything seemed calm, as if nothing special was going to happen. But for Walter Harris, today would not be an ordinary day at all. Walter had been a part of Elmwood for many years. He was an elderly man who had lived in this small town for most of his life. People knew him as the quiet man who sat by the window at the local bank. He wasn't rich, and he didn't like to talk much. He was just a kind soul who appreciated the simple things in life. Every morning, he would walk to the bank to deposit his small checks from his pension. He would chat with the tellers and ask about their days. Everyone in the bank knew him, and most of them liked him. Today, however, something felt different. Walter walked slowly toward the bank, his cane tapping softly on the pavement. The sun was warm, but it didn't feel as bright as usual. His footsteps echoed in the empty street, and for the first time in a long while, Walter felt uneasy. As he reached the front door of the bank, he paused for a moment. It was strange. He had been here so many times before, but today, something didn't feel right. He shrugged it off, telling himself he was just imagining things, and pushed the door open. The cool air inside the bank felt refreshing. The marble floors shone brightly under the lights. Walter could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet chatter of the employees. He walked toward the line at the counter, where several customers stood. It was a busy morning. Walter looked around, and for a brief second, he saw the tellers busy with other customers. It was as if he was just another face in the crowd. But that didn't bother him. He wasn't the type of man to seek attention. He moved up to the counter, where Karen, a young teller, was working. Karen had always been polite to him before, but there was something different in the way she looked at him today. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he could tell something had changed. "Good morning, Karen," Walter said softly, his voice as gentle as ever. "I'm here to deposit a check." Karen didn't smile. She glanced at him with a quick, almost impatient look, then turned to her computer without a word. Walter waited. He was used to the routine. He had been coming to this bank for years, and every time, it had been the same. But today, things felt off. Karen's fingers tapped quickly on the keyboard, her eyes focused on the screen. She didn't seem interested in talking. Walter watched her, waiting for her to say something, but she didn't. He cleared his throat softly. "I'm sorry, Karen. It's just a small deposit. It won't take long." Karen didn't respond. She kept typing, her face expressionless. Walter felt a pang of confusion. Was it something he had done? He wasn't sure. After a moment, Karen turned and grabbed a small slip of paper. She handed it to him without looking him in the eye. "Here," she said flatly. "Just fill this out." Walter took the paper, but before he could even ask if everything was all right, Karen turned to the next customer in line. Her attention was no longer on him. Walter stood there for a moment, his hand still holding the paper. He wasn't angry, he just didn't understand. This wasn't the friendly service he had come to expect. He filled out the deposit slip, still wondering what had happened. But when he returned to the counter, Karen didn't seem to notice. She was busy with another customer, a young man with a nice suit. Walter waited patiently as the young man finished his transaction. He could hear Karen speaking to him, but it was clear she had no intention of offering the same kind of attention to Walter. When it was Walter's turn again, he stepped forward. Karen glanced at him briefly, but it wasn't the warm look he had received in the past. This time, she seemed rushed, almost annoyed. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat. Walter nodded. "I'd like to make my deposit." Karen sighed and took the check from his hand without a word. She didn't smile. She didn't ask how his day was going. She simply processed the deposit quickly and handed him a receipt. "Thanks," she said, barely meeting his eyes. Walter stood there for a moment, staring at her. The coldness in her demeanor surprised him. He had known Karen for a while now. She had always been polite, even friendly. But today, she seemed different. As if something had changed in the way she looked at him. He felt a deep sadness in his chest. It wasn't just Karen. It felt like the whole bank had changed. The other tellers were no different. They moved about their work without acknowledging him. The customers who stood in line barely looked up. The usual chatter and friendly greetings were gone. It was as if Walter was invisible. He left the bank with a heavy heart, feeling the sting of being overlooked. It was a feeling he knew all too well. As an elderly man, he often felt like people no longer saw him. But it was different today. There was something in the air, something more than just the usual indifference. As Walter walked down the sidewalk, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been treated differently, not just because of his age, but because of something more. He thought about the years he had spent coming to this bank, the small transactions, the friendly faces. But now, he was just another old man in the way. He didn't understand why things had changed, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Walter's mind raced as he walked home that afternoon. He had always known that life wasn't easy when you got older, but he had never expected to feel invisible. It wasn't just the cold treatment at the bank. It was the small, everyday moments where people looked past him, not bothering to offer a helping hand, not even a kind word. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the sidewalk as he shuffled down the familiar path toward his small home. It was a simple house, nothing grand, but it had always been enough. Walter had lived there alone ever since his wife, Martha, passed away several years ago. The house was quiet, and sometimes, it felt too empty. But he had grown used to it. After all, he had his routines. He had his habits. And every day, he would walk to the bank, chat with the tellers, and return home. It wasn't much, but it was his life. But today, it felt different. There was a heaviness in his chest, a feeling of being left behind. The world had moved on, and Walter hadn't noticed it until now. People didn't have time for him anymore. He had become part of the background, like the old furniture no one bothered to look at twice. He reached his front door and paused. There was no one to greet him, no one to ask how his day had gone. It was just him. He turned the knob slowly and stepped inside. The house was quiet, as always. The only sound was the soft creak of the floorboards under his feet. Walter dropped his coat over the chair by the door and shuffled into the kitchen. The small radio on the counter played softly in the background, but it was just noise. He didn't really listen to it. Instead, he opened the fridge and took out a sandwich. He wasn't hungry, but he ate anyway. He always did, even when he wasn't feeling like it. As he sat at the kitchen table, his mind wandered back to the bank. Why had things changed? Was it something he had done? Or was it just the way the world had turned? He couldn't understand it. He had been going there for years. It had always been a place where he felt somewhat connected. A place where he wasn't just a nameless, faceless old man. But now it was like he didn't matter. The thought stung, but there was more to it than that. It wasn't just the coldness of Karen and the other tellers. It was the fact that he had been pushed to the side, ignored like so many others in his age group. It was as if the world had decided he no longer had a place in it. He finished his sandwich slowly, his thoughts heavy. What could he do about it? He wasn't the type to complain or make a fuss. He had always believed that if you did your part and kept to yourself, things would work out. But now, for the first time, he felt like that philosophy wasn't enough. Something had to change. Walter stood up from the table, his bones creaking as he moved. He walked over to the small shelf by the door and picked up his cane. It was worn, with a few dents and scratches here and there. But it was sturdy. It had served him well over the years. He paused for a moment, looking at the cane in his hand. He wasn't sure why, but he felt an odd sense of determination. Maybe it was time to do something different. Maybe it was time to stand up for himself. He wasn't sure what that would look like, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the urge to fight back. The next morning, Walter woke up early. He didn't have any big plans, but he knew he had to go back to the bank. He didn't know what he would say or do, but something inside him told him he had to face it. He had to face the coldness and see if there was any chance of things getting better. He dressed slowly, taking his time. He put on his old sweater, the one Martha had knitted for him. It was faded now, but it still fit him perfectly. He smiled to himself as he adjusted it, remembering how she had always taken such care in making sure he was warm. The morning air was crisp as he walked to the bank. It wasn't too cold, but it was enough to make him pull his coat tighter around his shoulders. As he neared the bank, his heart began to race. He wasn't sure why, but he felt nervous. What if they ignored him again? What if they treated him the same way they had yesterday? He reached the door of the bank, his hand resting on the handle. He took a deep breath. He had to do this. Slowly, he pushed the door open and walked inside. At first, it seemed like the same day all over again. The tellers were busy with other customers, their voices low as they processed transactions. Karen was at the counter again, her back to him. She didn't notice him as he walked up, but this time, Walter wasn't going to wait in silence. "Good morning, Karen," he said, his voice steady. She turned to face him, and for a moment, her eyes flickered with recognition. But there was no smile. No warmth. She simply nodded. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold. Walter felt a knot form in his stomach. But this time, he didn't back down. "I'd like to make a deposit," he said calmly, holding out the check. Karen's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. She didn't say anything else. Walter stood there, waiting. This time, he wasn't going to let her ignore him. He wasn't going to let her treat him like he was invisible. He waited as she finished the transaction, her movements mechanical. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she handed him the receipt. "Thanks," she said, her voice still lacking any emotion. Walter nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there for a moment, watching her. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell her how it felt to be treated this way, how it felt to be discarded, as if he didn't matter. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked away. As he left the counter, he passed by the other customers. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged him. It was as if he was invisible. But Walter wasn't going to let it go. He was determined to make his voice heard. He didn't know how yet, but he would find a way. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he held the deposit slip. His fingers were old, and his joints ached, but he did his best to stay steady. His grip on the paper was tight, not just because of the cold in the air but because something deep inside him had begun to change. He was used to being treated like this, dismissed as just an old man who didn't matter. But today, something was different. Today, he was going to stand his ground. He approached the counter with slow, deliberate steps, the sound of his cane tapping rhythmically on the floor echoing in the quiet space of the bank. He reached the front desk, where Karen stood, her eyes still focused on the screen in front of her. She didn't even glance up at him when he spoke. "Good morning, Karen," Walter said softly, his voice calm but firm. Karen barely looked up, her eyes flickering over him with a sense of impatience. She seemed distracted, like she didn't have the time to deal with him, just another old man who didn't quite belong in the fast-paced world of modern banking. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice barely hiding her annoyance. Walter nodded. "Just depositing a few checks, Karen." He could feel her eyes on him, and yet, she didn't seem to care much about his presence. She sighed, an almost audible sound of exasperation, before her fingers began to tap the keyboard in a mechanical rhythm. It was as if she was in a hurry to get rid of him, to move on to the next customer. "You know," Karen said, her voice sharp, "we don't really do this kind of thing for people your age anymore. You could use the app or the machine out front." Her words hit Walter like a cold gust of wind. It wasn't just the sharpness in her tone, it was the message behind them. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Walter was too old for her to bother with. The bank, it seemed, was more interested in convenience than in customer care. And he wasn't the kind of customer who mattered anymore. Walter's face tightened, but he didn't respond right away. He stood still for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle on him. He had heard this kind of thing before, in small ways, in moments just like this. People had stopped treating him with respect, had stopped seeing him as someone worthy of their time. It wasn't just Karen. It was the world. The world had changed, and Walter hadn't kept up with it. The younger customers in line didn't seem to care about what was happening. One young woman was busy tapping away on her phone, her eyes glued to the screen as if Walter wasn't even there. Another man, probably in his 30s, looked at the floor and checked his watch, too eager to get through his own business to notice what was going on at the counter. They were all too busy with their own lives to notice someone like Walter. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and Walter had learned to ignore it for the most part. He had become used to being overlooked, to being treated as if he were invisible. But today, it stung. It stung more than it ever had before. He was used to the quiet disrespect, but now, as he stood there, holding his small deposit slip in his wrinkled hands, it felt like something more. It felt like a change, something deeper than the usual indifference. This wasn't just about one teller or one customer. It was about something bigger, something that had been building up for a long time. And Walter could feel it, deep in his bones. Karen tapped away at the computer, her focus on the screen, her back to him now. She barely even noticed when Walter handed her the deposit slip, just taking it from him without a word. He couldn't believe how cold it had become. He had always trusted the bank, trusted the people who worked there. He had known Karen for years, and she had always been polite to him. But now, there was no warmth in her actions. There was no kindness, no recognition of who he was, of the man who had come to this bank for so long. Walter cleared his throat softly, hoping she would look at him. But she didn't. Instead, she sighed again and turned her attention to another customer who had just walked in. Walter stood there, frozen, waiting for her to finish. A deep sadness settled in his chest. He had been treated like this before, but it was always in small ways. A cold word here, a dismissive glance there. But now, it was as if he had become nothing more than an inconvenience, someone to be dealt with quickly so she could move on to something or someone more important. He tried to hold on to his patience, to not let it show how much her words had hurt him. He was used to it, after all. But today, it was different. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. As Karen finished the transaction and handed him the receipt, she barely acknowledged him, her eyes already on the next customer. Walter felt his heart sink. It was as if he wasn't even there, just a shadow moving through the bank. He took the receipt, but his fingers felt numb as he held it. He couldn't just walk away. Not this time. Something inside him had shifted. Something deep and quiet, but strong. He had been ignored for too long, pushed aside by the world that no longer seemed to care about him. He turned to leave, but as he walked past the other customers in line, something inside him made him stop. He looked at the young woman on her phone, scrolling through social media, oblivious to the world around her. He looked at the young man checking his watch, tapping his foot impatiently. He looked at the others, all too busy with their own lives to notice him, to care about what was happening right in front of them. Walter felt a spark of anger rise in him. It wasn't just about the bank. It wasn't just about Karen or the way she had treated him. It was about the way the world had changed. It was about how people had stopped caring, stopped noticing the quiet people, the old people, the ones who had always been there, doing their part. He wasn't just going to take it anymore. His hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't from age. It was from the realization that he had been silent for too long. He had let it go for too many years, just accepting the way things had become. But today, he was done. Walter took a deep breath and turned back toward the counter. The young customers were still distracted, their lives moving quickly, unaware of the quiet storm that was rising inside him. But Karen, the teller, was still at the desk, still focused on her computer. She hadn't noticed his return. "Karen," Walter said, his voice firm, though his heart was racing. She looked up at him, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "Yes?" she asked, her tone still dismissive. Walter took a step forward. "I think we need to talk." Walter's heart beat a little faster as he stood there, looking at Karen. He could feel the weight of his own words, the firmness in his voice. This was a moment he couldn't ignore, a moment when he had to make a choice. He couldn't walk away and let her treat him like this any longer. He had let people walk over him for too long. He had let his age be a reason for others to dismiss him, to disregard his value. "Karen," he repeated, his voice steady now, stronger than before, "I don't think you understand. I've been coming here for years. And I've never been treated like this." Karen blinked in surprise. She seemed a little taken aback by his sudden boldness, but her eyes quickly narrowed, the same impatience returning. "What's the problem now, sir?" she asked, her tone sharp. Walter's grip tightened on the deposit slip. He could feel his fingers, old and worn, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had something important to say. He wasn't going to shrink back. "I'm not just some old man who doesn't know how to use technology," he said, his voice rising slightly, though not in anger. "I know how to use the machines and the apps, but that's not the point. The point is, I've been a customer here for longer than you've probably been alive. I've trusted this bank for all these years, and now, you're treating me like I don't matter. You've been dismissive, and I've noticed it. It's not just today. It's been happening for a long time." Karen's face tightened, and for a brief moment, Walter thought she might say something to defend herself. But she didn't. She just stood there, her arms folded, her eyes avoiding his gaze. It was as though she couldn't bear to look him in the eye anymore. Walter didn't let that stop him. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to turn back now. "I don't need to be treated like a child. I don't need anyone to make assumptions about me just because I'm older. I'm here to do business, the same as anyone else. I expect respect. And if this bank is no longer willing to give me that respect, then I'll have to reconsider whether this is the place for me." There was a tense silence between them, the sound of the other customers fading into the background. Walter could hear his own heartbeat, slow but steady, thumping in his chest. He had spoken the truth. The words had left his lips without hesitation, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of power rising inside him. It wasn't about being loud or forceful. It was about standing up for himself, about making sure his voice was heard, even if it wasn't easy. Karen didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her lips pursed. She seemed to be weighing something in her mind, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. For a moment, Walter thought she might dismiss him again, that she might just tell him to leave. But then something changed in her expression. Her eyes softened, just a little, though it was hard to tell if she was genuinely sorry or if it was just the pressure of the moment. "I'm sorry, sir," she said after a long pause, her voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to upset you. It's just, there are so many customers these days, and we're trying to keep things running smoothly. Sometimes, we don't always pay attention like we should." Walter wasn't sure if he believed her words. He didn't know if she was genuinely sorry or if she was just saying what she thought he wanted to hear. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had spoken up. He had made himself heard. "I understand that you're busy," Walter said, his voice a little softer now, "but I'm still a customer. I deserve the same courtesy as anyone else. Age doesn't change that." Karen nodded, though her expression was still uncertain. She glanced at the other customers in line, who were now staring, some of them a little uncomfortable, others just curious. Walter could feel the weight of their attention, but he didn't let it faze him. He had already said what needed to be said. He wasn't going to back down now. "I'll make sure to be more careful in the future," Karen said finally. "Thank you for your patience, sir." Walter nodded. "Thank you," he said, and though the exchange had been difficult, he felt a small sense of relief. The tension that had been building inside him seemed to ease, if only a little. He had confronted the issue. He had spoken his truth, and now he was ready to move forward. As he turned to leave the counter, Walter noticed the other customers again. Their eyes were still on him, but this time, there was something different. They weren't just ignoring him anymore. There was a hint of respect in their glances. They had seen what had happened. They had witnessed his courage. And maybe, just maybe, it had made them think twice about how they treated others. Walter walked slowly toward the exit, his cane tapping on the floor with each step. He didn't look back at Karen or the others. He didn't need to. What mattered was that he had stood up for himself. What mattered was that, for once, he hadn't let the world pass him by. The door of the bank opened with a soft chime as he stepped outside. The sunlight hit his face, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world was open to him. He took a deep breath of the fresh air, feeling the cool breeze on his skin. As he walked down the street toward his home, Walter couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about getting revenge or proving anything to anyone. It was about standing up for his dignity, for his right to be seen and heard, no matter how old he was. And in that moment, he knew that, no matter what happened next, he had reclaimed something that had been taken from him. He had reclaimed his voice. Weeks passed, and with each visit to the bank, Walter's discomfort grew. It wasn't just the way Karen treated him anymore. It was the way the entire atmosphere had shifted. The once friendly environment he had trusted for years had slowly turned cold. The smiles, the warm greetings, the small talks, all of it had disappeared. The staff was distant, curt, and indifferent. No one seemed to care about him. Every time he stepped inside, it felt like he was intruding on a place that no longer wanted him. Karen's attitude had worsened. She barely acknowledged him anymore, and when she did, it was with a forced politeness that didn't fool anyone. Her eyes would flicker over him like he was just another number, another problem to be solved quickly. She would process his deposit without looking at him, her hands moving quickly and without thought, as though she were rushing him out of the way. Walter couldn't understand what had happened. He had been a loyal customer for so long, never missing a visit, always doing things by the book. But now, it seemed like his loyalty meant nothing. He felt like a burden, a nuisance. It was as though he had become invisible, except for the occasional cold glance from Karen or one of her co-workers. But the worst part wasn't the way they treated him. It was the feeling that something bigger was happening, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The way the bank had changed, the strange new policies they introduced, the way the employees looked at him with barely concealed disdain, it all seemed like pieces of a puzzle that Walter was starting to put together. One afternoon, as Walter sat quietly in the waiting area, something caught his attention. It wasn't the usual noise of the bank, the ringing phones, the sound of keyboards clicking, the chatter of customers. No, this was something different. It was a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. Karen was speaking to her manager, Greg. Walter tried to make himself as invisible as possible, but his old ears still picked up the words. It was hard not to. "Greg, we really need to start cutting back on some of the elderly clients," Karen said, her voice low, but clear enough for Walter to hear. "You know, the ones who take too long with their transactions. They're slowing down the process. It's getting harder to keep up with all of them." Greg's response was even more chilling. "I agree. They don't even want to use the machines. They keep asking for help, and it's slowing everything down. Maybe it's time to focus more on the younger, faster clients. The ones who can use the app or the ATM. They're easier to deal with, anyway." Walter's heart sank as he heard these words. He knew that the bank had been shifting toward more modern technology. He had heard the advertisements, seen the signs for the new mobile app and the convenient ATMs. But this felt different. This wasn't just about technology. It was about something deeper. It was about making people like him, people who weren't quick with apps and machines, feel unwanted, unwelcome. He had heard whispers of policies like this before, but hearing it confirmed, right in front of him, made it all too real. The words echoed in his mind long after Karen and Greg had finished their conversation. Cutting back on elderly clients. Slowing down the process. Walter felt his chest tighten. The reality of what he was hearing hit him hard. The bank, the place he had trusted for so many years, was no longer the same. It was no longer a place where customers were valued for their loyalty. It was a place that cared only for efficiency, for speed, for convenience at the expense of people like him. Walter sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of everything he had just heard. He had been coming to this bank for decades, always following the rules, always doing his part. And now, it seemed like the very institution he had trusted was turning its back on him. The idea of being pushed aside simply because of his age was almost too much to bear. He tried to shake off the feeling of betrayal. He had to stay focused. He couldn't let them push him out. He had to do something. But what could he do? How could he fight back against a system that seemed to have already made up its mind about people like him? As the days passed, Walter couldn't help but notice more small signs that something was wrong. The new policies weren't just about technology. They were about the way the staff treated him and others. The way they rushed through transactions, barely acknowledging the elderly customers. The way they seemed to avoid eye contact, as if they were trying to get through their shifts without being bothered by anyone who didn't fit into their vision of the perfect customer. One morning, Walter walked in to find a new sign on the wall, one that hadn't been there before. It read, "For faster service, please use the self-service kiosk or the mobile app." It was a simple message, but it felt like a slap in the face. The words were clear: if you couldn't use the technology, you were no longer welcome here. Walter's blood ran cold as he stared at the sign. He had seen it before, in other places. Businesses that didn't care about their older customers, businesses that only cared about speed and efficiency. He had never imagined it would happen at his bank, the one place he thought he could rely on. It wasn't just the sign that bothered him, it was the unspoken message behind it: people like him didn't matter anymore. The elderly were now seen as a problem, an obstacle to the smooth running of business. The more Walter thought about it, the angrier he became. He had been a loyal customer, a steady presence in the bank for so many years. He had always followed the rules, paid his bills on time, and never asked for anything in return. But now, it seemed like loyalty didn't matter. What mattered was who could use the machines, who could download the app, who could move quickly and efficiently through the bank without needing any help. Walter had never been the kind of person to make waves. He had always kept to himself, always done what was expected of him. But now, something inside him was changing. He couldn't just sit back and accept this. He couldn't let them push him aside, couldn't let them erase his presence like he didn't matter. He had to do something. But what? It wasn't just about the bank anymore. It was about the way the world had started to treat people like him. It was about ageism, about being cast aside because of his age. He had seen it in other places, heard about it on the news. But now, it was happening to him. It was happening to people like him every single day, all over the world. Walter wasn't ready to accept it. He wasn't ready to be treated like a second-class citizen, like someone who didn't belong. He had lived too long, had seen too much, to let this pass without a fight. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. The strange policies, the cold treatment, the whispers in the back room, it was all part of a bigger plan. And Walter was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about one bank. It was about something much larger. It was about how society was changing, how the elderly were being pushed out of places they had once called home. The next day, Walter entered the bank again. It felt like any other day at first. The same familiar smell of polished floors, the same soft hum of the machines, the same quiet voices of the customers waiting in line. He shuffled toward the counter, his hands shaking slightly, but this time, he wasn't just here for another simple transaction. This time, he had a purpose. As he approached the counter, Karen glanced up at him with her usual disinterested expression, as if she was already bored with his presence. She didn't greet him, didn't ask how he was doing. Instead, she simply motioned for him to hand over the deposit slip, barely looking at him as she took it. Walter handed it over silently. His heart was heavy with the weight of everything that had been happening over the past few weeks, the cold treatment, the new policies, the conversations he had overheard. He felt like a ghost in this place. A man who had been loyal for so many years, now treated like a nuisance. It wasn't just about the bank anymore. It was about the world changing in ways he wasn't ready for. The world that seemed to be forgetting people like him. But then, something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything. The door to the bank opened with a sudden rush of cold air, and in walked a tall figure that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the room. The usual sounds of the bank quieted down, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Walter blinked, his heart racing. It was none other than Shaquille O'Neal. The Shaq. The towering basketball legend. His presence filled the room, his broad shoulders and deep voice making everyone turn their heads. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the room as if he was looking for something or someone. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The staff at the counter froze. Karen stopped tapping on the keyboard, her eyes wide with surprise. Even Greg, the bank manager, who was usually so calm and collected, seemed caught off guard by Shaq's sudden arrival. Walter, who had been staring at the floor, looked up in disbelief. He had never expected anything like this. Shaq wasn't just a basketball player, he was an icon, a man whose name everyone knew, a man who stood for so much more than just sports. And now, here he was, standing in the very bank where Walter had felt so invisible. Shaquille O'Neal stood tall, his eyes scanning the room. It wasn't just his size that demanded attention, it was the calm confidence he exuded. It was clear that he wasn't here by accident. He was here for a reason. Is there a problem here? Shaq's voice was deep and commanding, but it carried a sense of kindness and authority. It boomed across the room, making the staff stiffen. The silence was deafening. Greg, the manager, seemed to struggle for a moment before finally responding. He was nervous, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected situation. No. No problem at all, Mr. O'Neill. How can we help you today? Shaq didn't even look at Greg. Instead, his eyes locked onto Karen, then to the rest of the staff, before turning back to the manager. I heard what's been going on here, Shaq continued, his voice still calm but with an edge of seriousness. And I'm not leaving until this gets fixed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Walter stood in shock, barely able to believe what was happening. Why was Shaq here? What did he mean by fixing it? Karen opened her mouth to speak, but Shaq raised a hand, silencing her. I don't want to hear excuses, he said firmly. I don't care about your policies, your machines, or your so-called efficiency. What I care about is how you treat your customers. And I've heard enough to know that something needs to change here. Walter's mind was racing. He couldn't understand what was going on. How did Shaq know about what had been happening at the bank? How did he know that he and so many others had been treated unfairly? Walter had spent years here, never imagining that someone like Shaq would come to his defense. And yet, here he was, standing right next to him. Shaq turned to Walter, his eyes softening slightly. I know you've been through a lot, Mr. Harris, he said, his voice much gentler now. I know this isn't easy, but you don't have to take this anymore. You've been loyal to this bank for years, and you deserve respect. Not just you, but everyone who walks through these doors, no matter their age, no matter how long it takes them to do their banking. People like you matter. Walter felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent so many days feeling invisible, pushed aside, like he didn't matter. But here was this giant of a man, this celebrity, standing up for him in a way he could never have imagined. Shaq wasn't just a famous basketball player, in that moment, he was a symbol of everything Walter needed to hear. That he mattered. That his voice was important. Greg cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Mr. O'Neill, I understand your concern, but we're just trying to streamline the process. We're just trying to move things along more efficiently. It's nothing personal. Shaq took a step forward, his gaze hardening. It's not personal, he repeated, his voice rising slightly. Then why does it feel like you're pushing people aside, like they don't matter? Why does it feel like you're telling everyone who isn't as fast as you to just go away? That's not efficiency, that's disrespect. Greg seemed to shrink under Shaq's gaze, his face turning red with embarrassment. The other staff members exchanged nervous glances, clearly uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. Walter, still in shock, finally found his voice. He turned to Greg, his voice shaky but firm. I've been coming here for years, Greg. I've always done everything by the book, and this is how you treat me? You don't care about my loyalty, or the loyalty of anyone else who's been coming here for years. You just care about who can use the app and the machines. You don't care about the people who helped build this bank into what it is. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Walter had never said anything like this before. He had always been the quiet one, the one who took things in stride. But now, the anger he had been holding in for so long bubbled to the surface. He was tired of being ignored, tired of being pushed aside, tired of feeling like he didn't matter. Shaq placed a hand on Walter's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to stand alone anymore, Mr. Harris. You've got someone in your corner now. The room was silent as everyone processed what had just happened. The bank manager, Greg, stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The staff behind the counter didn't know what to do either. And Walter? He felt like he was standing on solid ground for the first time in a long time. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice small. "We'll do better," he muttered. "We'll change things. We'll make sure no one is treated this way again. I promise." Shaq's gaze didn't soften. "You better," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what's been going on here." The tension in the room was palpable. Walter couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. The man who had once felt invisible was now standing in the spotlight, his voice heard by all. And the man who had always been treated like a nuisance was now standing beside a giant, a symbol of power and influence. Shaq wasn't just a basketball legend. He was an advocate for change, for justice, for fairness. And he had just made sure that Walter's voice was heard. Shaq's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with meaning. Walter stood there, not fully believing what had just happened. He had spent his entire life avoiding attention, staying quiet and keeping to himself, but now, he felt like the whole room was watching him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. The staff behind the counter were still in shock, unsure of how to respond. Karen, the teller who had been so dismissive of him just a few moments ago, had her mouth open as though she were about to say something but stopped herself. She glanced over at Greg, who was standing at the front of the counter, still trying to regain his composure. Greg shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as he tried to regain some control of the situation. "Mr. O'Neill, I don't think you fully understand. This is just how things have to be now," Greg said, his voice wavering. "It's not personal, it's just business." Shaq raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Business? You're telling me that treating people like Walter this way is business?" he asked, his voice becoming more pointed. "You're running a business, sure. But there's a thing called respect. You can't just throw people away because they don't fit your new system." Walter felt a fire spark inside him. He had spent so many years being overlooked, dismissed, and now, hearing Shaq call out the bank's actions, it felt like a wave of strength was building up inside him. He wasn't just a man quietly sitting in a corner anymore. He was someone worth standing up for. "Maybe," Walter began, his voice stronger now, "it's not just about efficiency. Maybe it's about people. Real people. People who've trusted this bank for decades. I may be old, but I remember when things were different. When you treated people with respect, no matter how old they were." He glanced at the other customers in the bank, who had been watching the scene unfold, some of them wide-eyed, others quietly listening. Walter hadn't realized it, but they had all been waiting for someone to speak up. The younger ones who had been ignoring him earlier, scrolling on their phones, now looked up, suddenly paying attention. They could see the injustice, too. They could see how wrong it was for Walter to be treated this way. Shaq nodded, his eyes not leaving Greg. "See? That's the problem right there," he said, his voice steady but powerful. "You treat people like they don't matter until someone steps in and makes you see the truth. And that's not how it should be." The room was still, the air thick with tension. Walter felt as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. For so many years, he had felt powerless, but now, he had a voice. And that voice wasn't just his, it was the voice of everyone who had been ignored, pushed aside, or forgotten. Greg shifted again, his face flushed with embarrassment. I see your point," he said, looking at Walter now with something that resembled guilt. "We've been trying to modernize, and we've forgotten about the people who have been here since the beginning." Shaq's expression softened, but only a little. "It's not too late to fix things, Greg," he said firmly. "You can change. All you need is to remember who you're really serving here. It's not just about the new systems. It's about the people who walk through those doors." Walter could hardly believe what he was hearing. Shaquille O'Neal, the man who had once dominated the basketball court, was now standing up for him. For him. Walter had been the quiet old man in the corner for so long. He had never expected this kind of attention. He had never imagined that someone like Shaq would come to his defense, let alone call out the bank for how they treated their customers. Shaq looked back at Walter, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said. "But you've got people who care now. People who see the value in what you've given to this place." Walter could feel the warmth of Shaq's words wrapping around him like a blanket. For so many years, he had walked into the bank feeling small, feeling invisible. But now, he was standing tall, his heart swelling with pride. Greg nodded, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation sank in. "I promise we'll do better," he said, his voice sounding small now. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Shaq turned to leave, but before he did, he paused and looked back at Walter. "You've got my number, Mr. Harris," he said, giving him a wink. "If they ever forget you again, you let me know. I'll be back." Walter nodded slowly, still in disbelief. He had always been a man of few words, and he wasn't sure how to express how much this moment meant to him. But somehow, just having Shaq stand up for him had made him feel seen, heard, and respected in a way he hadn't in years. The tension in the bank slowly began to dissolve. Greg seemed to shrink under the weight of Shaq's words, and the staff behind the counter were left scrambling to recover from the unexpected encounter. As Shaq walked out of the bank, his towering figure casting a long shadow over the room, Walter stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He had been in this same bank 100 times, but now, everything felt different. The way the staff looked at him, the way the other customers quietly watched him, it was like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in a long time, Walter felt like he belonged. Like he mattered. He turned and walked to the counter, the usual nervousness he felt fading away. Karen was standing there, still trying to process what had just happened. Walter took a deep breath, then calmly placed his deposit slip on the counter. "Just the usual," he said, his voice steady. "And thank you for helping me today." Karen blinked, looking at him in surprise. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she silently took the slip and processed the transaction, her hands shaking slightly. As Walter walked out of the bank, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had stood up for himself. He had been heard. And, for once, he wasn't just an invisible old man. He was someone who had made a difference. The weight of the situation hung in the air, heavy with anticipation. Walter, still standing by the counter, was hardly able to process the whirlwind of events. His hands shook, not from age, but from the surge of emotions running through him. All these years, all this mistreatment, and in a matter of moments, everything had changed. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. Shaquille O'Neal, the towering figure who had walked into the bank just moments ago, was still there, an immovable presence. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. It was as if everything else around them had faded into the background, and Walter's quiet voice was the only thing that mattered now. And yet, it wasn't just his voice that was being heard, it was the voice of everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or treated unfairly. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Walter could hear the faint sound of his own heartbeat as he glanced over at Greg, the bank manager. Greg's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room as though searching for an escape. But there was no escaping now. There was no way out of this. Shaq's words had hit their mark. They were simple, but they were powerful. "You've been treating this man, and others like him, with disrespect. That's not how we do things." Those words echoed in Walter's mind. It wasn't just the words that had struck him, but the way Shaq said them, so sure, so confident. It was the tone of someone who believed in justice, in fairness. It was the tone of someone who had never been afraid to stand up for what was right, no matter the situation. Greg tried to find words to respond, but they faltered on his tongue. He looked at Shaq, then back at Walter, his face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't mean for it to be like this, Greg stammered, his voice unsteady. It's just the new policies. We're trying to streamline things, make everything more efficient. Shaq's brow furrowed, and he took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Greg. Efficiency doesn't mean treating people like they're invisible. It doesn't mean pushing people aside because they don't fit your new system. People are more than just numbers on a screen. You can't forget that. The words hung in the air, sharp and direct. It was as if Shaq had opened a window, letting in a breath of fresh air into a room that had grown stale with greed and indifference. Walter had never imagined that a moment like this would come. He had spent so many years feeling like an afterthought, like an old man who no one cared to listen to. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. He felt valued. Karen, who had been standing quietly behind the counter, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted between Shaq and Greg, a look of unease on her face. She had been one of the employees who had treated Walter with indifference, with coldness. But now, in the face of Shaq's towering presence, she seemed to shrink. The walls she had built around herself, the walls that allowed her to dismiss the elderly and the vulnerable, were crumbling. The weight of the truth was sinking in. Shaq pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his finger tapping quickly on the screen. He didn't need to say much, just a few words, and the regional director was on the other end of the line. The conversation was brief, but it was enough. The decision was made. The policies that had allowed the bank to treat customers like Walter with disdain would be reversed. The system of prioritizing younger, tech-savvy clients over the elderly would end. Walter could hardly believe it. He stood there, watching as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had been treated unfairly. The elderly, the vulnerable, the ones who had been pushed aside by the rapid pace of modern life. For too long, they had been forgotten. But now, things were changing. As Shaq hung up the phone, he turned to Walter with a small, reassuring smile. "It's done," he said. "They're going to fix this. The policies are reversed, and things will go back to the way they should be." Walter's heart swelled with gratitude. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't wanted a confrontation, hadn't wanted to be the center of attention. All he had wanted was to be treated with dignity. But now, in a moment, the entire bank had been forced to confront its mistakes. And it was all because someone had cared enough to stand up and speak out. Karen was the first to speak up, though her voice was shaky. I'm sorry," she said quietly, her eyes cast downward. "I didn't realize what I was doing. I didn't realize how much it hurt." She paused for a moment, as if struggling to find the right words. "I'll do better. I promise." Walter nodded slowly. He didn't expect an apology, not really. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but he didn't want to hold grudges. What mattered now was that things had changed. The system had been shaken, and the truth had been revealed. Greg, too, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. His shoulders slumped, and he took a deep breath, as if trying to shake off the weight of his own mistakes. I've let this place become something it shouldn't have been," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've treated people like numbers, and that's wrong. I promise you, Mr. Harris, that I will make sure this doesn't happen again." The tension in the room began to dissipate. The staff were no longer acting with the same coldness. Instead, they were softening, becoming more human. Walter could see it in their eyes. They understood now. They had seen the truth, and it had changed them. Walter looked around the bank, his gaze sweeping over the other customers who had been watching the scene unfold. He noticed the younger people who had been staring at their phones earlier. They were no longer ignoring him. They were watching, listening. And in their eyes, he saw something different: respect. A sense of understanding. The door to the bank opened, and Walter felt the cool breeze of the outside world rush in. He took a deep breath, his heart still racing from the events of the past few moments. But as he stepped forward, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight had been won. The world, at least in this small corner of it, was a little bit better now. As he walked out of the bank, Shaq gave him a final nod. "Take care, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "And remember, never let anyone make you feel small." Walter smiled, the weight of years of frustration lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady. Shaq watched him for a moment, then turned to leave. And as Walter walked out into the sunlight, he knew that things would be different now. The world had shifted, just a little, and he was no longer invisible. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone of something important, that respect, dignity, and kindness should never be forgotten, no matter who you are. As Shaq walked out of the bank, his large figure disappearing into the sunlight, Walter stood there for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. The air in the bank was different now, lighter, somehow. The oppressive weight of neglect and indifference had been lifted, if only for a brief moment. Walter had always been the quiet type, never one to seek attention or make a scene. But today, his simple act of standing up for himself had sparked something bigger. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or forgotten. Walter looked around the bank one last time. The staff, though still a little shaken, seemed to be behaving differently. Their posture was straighter, their expressions softer. They had been forced to confront their own actions, and now, they seemed genuinely remorseful. Karen, who had once been so dismissive, was now offering warm smiles to customers, trying to make up for the way she had treated them in the past. Greg, the manager, stood by the counter, nodding along to a conversation with a client, his earlier arrogance gone. The changes were subtle, but they were there. Walter could feel it. He glanced over at the other customers, who had been witnesses to the entire exchange. They no longer looked past him, distracted by their phones or their busy lives. Now, they watched him with a sense of respect and understanding. There was no longer any indifference in their eyes, only recognition. Walter felt the weight of their gazes, but this time, it didn't feel uncomfortable. This time, he knew they saw him for who he was, not just the elderly man who came in to deposit checks, but a person who had a right to be treated with dignity. Walter stepped outside, feeling the cool air on his face. The sunlight bathed him in warmth, but it wasn't just the sun that made him feel lighter. It was the sense of justice, of fairness, that now seemed to hang in the air. Things had changed in that bank today, and Walter had played a part in it. But he wasn't alone. He had been helped by someone who could have easily ignored the situation but chose not to. Shaq had shown up, not because it was his fight, but because he recognized that Walter's fight was everyone's fight. As Walter walked down the street, he thought about how small acts could create waves of change. He had never considered himself a fighter. In fact, he had spent most of his life avoiding conflict, preferring to stay in the background. But today, Walter had learned something important, that sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't about being loud or forceful. It's about finding the courage to speak up when it feels like no one is listening. Sometimes, it only takes a small spark to ignite a fire, and that fire could change everything. In the past, Walter might have just accepted the treatment he received at the bank. He might have thought it was just part of growing old, part of being overlooked. But today, he realized that it didn't have to be that way. He didn't have to accept being ignored, dismissed, or treated unfairly just because of his age. No one should ever have to feel invisible. Everyone, no matter how old or young, deserves to be seen, heard, and respected. Walter had spent so many years trying to blend into the background, to avoid causing any trouble. But now, he knew that his voice mattered. He understood that it wasn't about shouting the loudest or demanding attention. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how small the action seemed. Even the smallest voice, the quietest person in the room, could make a difference. Sometimes, it wasn't the loudest or the most forceful person who changed the world. It was the one with the courage to stand firm, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. As Walter walked through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, he saw the world with new eyes. The people around him, the ones who had once ignored him, now seemed different. He saw them not just as strangers passing by, but as fellow human beings, people with their own stories, their own struggles, and their own battles. Walter realized that everyone, no matter their age or background, had something valuable to offer. Everyone deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. And if he could stand up for himself, then maybe others could find the courage to do the same. He passed by the park, where children were playing, their laughter filling the air. For a moment, Walter stood still, watching them. He thought about how easy it was for people to forget the elderly, to overlook them as they focused on their own busy lives. But he also knew that change was possible. Change was always possible, as long as there were people who cared enough to make a difference. Walter's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice. "Hey, Mr. Harris." He turned around and saw a young man walking towards him. It was one of the customers from the bank, someone who had witnessed the entire confrontation. The young man smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "What you did today, it was incredible. You really showed us all what it means to stand up for yourself." Walter smiled, touched by the words. "Thank you," he said simply. "But it wasn't just me. Sometimes, all it takes is a little help from someone who cares." The young man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think you're right. And I think we all need to do more to treat people with respect, no matter who they are." Walter's heart swelled with pride. The words of this young man were a small but powerful reminder that change was already happening. It wasn't just the bank that had changed, it was the people who had witnessed what had happened. They were beginning to see the world through a different lens. They were starting to understand that respect, kindness, and dignity were not things to be taken for granted. They were things to be fought for, even in the smallest of moments. As Walter continued on his way, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The journey he had taken that day had been long, but it had been worth it. He had fought for what was right, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or dismissed. And in doing so, he had reminded others of something important, that sometimes, the quietest person in the room has the most power. Sometimes, it takes a little courage to make a big difference. And sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up for what's right to change the world around them. As Walter looked up at the sky, he knew that the world was full of possibilities. And that no matter how old he got, no matter how many times he was ignored, he would always have the power to make a difference. The power of kindness, the power of standing up for what was right, those were the things that could never be taken away. And as long as he held onto those values, Walter knew that he would always be a force for good in the world. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the city. Walter walked a little taller now, his steps lighter, knowing that his quiet act of bravery had made the world just a little bit better. And in that moment, he realized something else, that change was not always about big, dramatic gestures. Sometimes, it was about the small, quiet moments. The moments when someone stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. And those were the moments that had the power to change everything. No matter who you are, no matter how old or young, your voice matters. Your actions matter. And the world needs more people who are willing to stand up for what's right, even in the smallest of ways. And that was the greatest lesson Walter had learned.